If you're throwing every spare dollar at your mortgage instead of investing, you might be making a $250,000 mistake. Everyone tells you paying off your mortgage as fast as possible is one of the best things you can do for your financial future. And while it's not the worst thing in the world, a lot of people give that advice when it isn't necessarily true. So in this video, we're going to be breaking down the real numbers of what this looks like for your financial future and if this is the best strategy for you or not. And so the short version of this is if we were to run the numbers straight away and said you had an extra $500 every single month that you could either invest or pay down your mortgage, what would that lead to? If you were to pay down your mortgage with this extra $500 a month, you'd save around $175,000 of interest. But if you were to invest this into a low-cost index fund that invests in the S&P 500, based on historical long-term averages, you'd end up with around $425,000, which is a $250,000 gap. So does this mean you should just invest any excess money you have? Well, not necessarily. This depends on one thing that we're going to talk about later in the video, and we're also going to dive into this maths deeper in this video as well. Okay, so let's talk about mortgages first. And here in New Zealand, at least, the average long-term interest rate on a residential mortgage is around 5.5%. And so the benefit of paying down your mortgage faster is essentially if you're at 5.5% interest rate, that's a guaranteed 5.5% return on your money without the risk of volatile markets or anything. It's a guaranteed 5.5% no tax return. And beyond just the return itself, it also means you're paying down your debt, which for some people can be a source of stress, and it could help you sleep at night, knowing that you're paying down debt. Okay, so that's a perfectly fine strategy, but what's the counterpoint to that? What if we invested that in a low-cost index fund that invested in the S&P 500 that returned almost double it? So if we use the 5.5% interest rate on your mortgage, if you're paying that down, over the last century or so, the S&P 500 has returned roughly 10% per year. And because it's a low-cost index fund that just tracks the market and isn't actively managed, these often have very low fees, something like 0.1% annually. But what's the catch of this higher returns that you can expect? Well, it's that the returns aren't guaranteed. It's not a locked-in interest rate just like your mortgage is, but it is very volatile. Sometimes it can be down 20%, some years it can be up 20%, but it averages out over long term to around 10% per annum. Okay, so let's break down those numbers we used at the start of this video to compare these two options to see how we got there. Well, let's say you start with a $500,000 mortgage, which is pretty average these days, and you're at a 5.5% interest rate. Now, again, we're going to stick with that extra $500 per month. And if you were to pay this on a 30-year mortgage, this is going to bring your mortgage term down to 21 years. That's going to save you about $175,000. Again, that's locked in and guaranteed to be a return based on your current interest rate on your mortgage. Now, if we were to take that $500 again, but instead of paying off the mortgage and put it on a low-cost index fund over the same 21 years, returning 10% per annum, we're going to be looking at around $425,000. But the key thing with this is pre-tax. The mortgage number is after tax. You don't pay tax on paying down your debt, but most countries will have some sort of tax on capital gains or investments. So as this is a YouTube video, it's obviously difficult to estimate what the tax will be in your country that you're living in individually. But the good thing is most countries have some sort of tax advantaged investment structures. So here in New Zealand, we have PI funds. Overseas, you have things like an IRA, superannuation in Australia. There's all sorts of funds and ways you can do this overseas to save some tax. But if you can figure out what the tax would be in your country, you can also figure out what your returns would be after tax and compare that to paying down your mortgage. But I've done the maths, and so basically you would have to be paying at least 41% tax on that $425,000 from your investments to make it not worth it and to make paying down your mortgage more worth it. So again, you're going to have to figure out how tax works in your country, but assuming most people aren't paying 41% tax on their capital gains or their investments should still be a better option financially, at least on paper, based on the assumptions we've used. Now, there was one question that I mentioned at the start of this video that could be more important than the interest rate you return or the tax you're paying on your returns, and this is, when do you actually need this money that you're investing? And the reason for this is volatility. One of the cons of investing into the share market is it is very volatile. So if you have less than 5 years to invest, ideally, maybe potentially even less than 10 years to invest, investing in the S&P 500 or any other fund can be risky due to this volatility, whereas paying down your mortgage is almost essentially a guaranteed return on the interest you are paying. And there is just one more nuance to this. If you were to put all your extra funds into paying down your mortgage with the hopes of maybe using this equity to buy an investment property in the future, or to top up your mortgage and to use these funds for any other reason, the risk that you have is potentially if your house was to go down in value, are you still going to be able to withdraw those funds? And so that's just a question of, if you really need this money for something and you're saving for something, that is a risk to be aware of. However, at least here in New Zealand, banks have things like redraw facilities, offset accounts, and revolving credits that are much less risky because you still have access to those funds regardless of what happens to your house value. Another thing that I want to mention before you start putting any excess funds either into shares or to paying off your mortgage is there's two things you want to make sure you've done first. Firstly is pay down any high interest debt. Anything over 10%, if you have debt with a higher interest rate than that, pay that off before you start saving or paying down other debts like your mortgage. The other thing is having a fully funded emergency fund of 3 to 6 months of expenses. Both of these two things should be ticked off before you invest into shares or pay down your mortgage with extra repayments. But assuming you got these two things ticked off, there's actually another thing that we could talk about is you don't need to go all in on one section. You don't need to put all your money towards paying off your mortgage or putting all your money into the share market. You can actually split this 50-50 if you prefer some certainty of a guaranteed 5.5% return or whatever interest rate you're on with your mortgage, or some of the extra gains you could get potentially from investing into a low-cost index fund that invests in something like the S&P 500 or some other equivalent. You could put $250 per month on both of these, or any sort of split that you're comfortable with. Now, if you have more questions about this, especially if you're getting closer to retirement, maybe speaking to a financial advisor would be something that would be helpful for you. If you're here in New Zealand, feel free to get in touch and I can help you with it.